For the first time in over 100 years, the Federal Reserve is losing money. And guess who gets to pay for it? Of course, you and I and the American taxpayer. And the burden will most likely fall the heaviest on the middle class because that is what it always does. So what I want to do is I want to give you the facts so you know exactly what is going on. Then I want to talk about how we even got here in the first place. And then I want to discuss if this is fair to begin with for the American public. So let's do just that. As always, my name is Derek, and I got my degree in finance, so you don't have to. I hope you are having a fantastic day. Let's get straight to the facts. So first and foremost, the Federal Reserve has lost over $110 billion in 2023. That equates to $2.5 billion every single week. And moving forward, because this hasn't just magically stopped. So every single week moving forward, the American taxpayer is going to be burdened with another $2.5 billion of Federal Reserve losses. Why is this happening? What has to do with policies? Most specifically, policies that happened in 2020 and policies that are currently happening today and the difference between those two. So let's go back real quick to 2020, where basically all our problems seem to come from. So in 2020, the Federal Reserve, along with the US government, wanted to prop up the economy because of everything that was going on. Now, the Federal Reserve does this in two main ways: by lowering the federal funds rate or by quantitative easing, or a combination of both. In 2020, the federal funds rate was already really low. So when it has that kind of situation, it has to use something else, which is known as quantitative easing. Most people know this as printing money. Now, it's not actually printing money. What it is doing is it is creating bank reserves out of thin air. That's where the name comes from. And then it uses these bank reserves to purchase treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities, which theoretically, over the long term, will lower the long-term interest rate. This spurs economic growth, and it causes the economy to grow or to prop up the economy. Now, this is where the problem comes in, because the Federal Reserve did this in trillions upon trillions of dollars. Okay, it bought trillions upon trillions of interest-bearing assets, and these assets are generating for the Fed around 2%, okay, on these assets. Now, fast forward to today. 3 years later, the Federal Reserve says, oh shit, we have inflation. We have a ton of inflation. So what does it do? It does the opposite. It raises the federal funds rate, which is why the federal funds rate currently is sitting at 5.5%. The problem is the Fed doesn't just own treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities and interest-bearing assets. It also holds cash deposits, and it pays interest on those cash deposits. It also borrows money, and it pays interest on that borrowed money. So that is where the discrepancy is. So currently, the Federal Reserve owns about $8 trillion in treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities, and those are paying about 2%. It has also borrowed about $5 trillion, and that money currently is costing the Fed 5+%. So because of that discrepancy, the Federal Reserve is bringing in about $70 billion in interest. It is bringing that money in, but it is paying about $100 billion more than that in interest expenses, which is where you get this discrepancy. Okay. Now the CBO, here's another thing that's quite interesting. The CBO, which is the Congressional Budget Office, okay, states that the debt for the United States, the interest paid on that debt for this year is going to be about $640 billion. The thing is, the Budget Office does not include Federal Reserve interest expense, most likely because it is so rare that the Federal Reserve loses money. Okay, the Federal Reserve usually generates money, so it doesn't even include that, which means that the actual amount spent on the interest of U.S. debt by the government is about $100 billion higher, because there's about $100 billion of interest payments that the Federal Reserve is currently paying. And it'll be $2.5 billion every single week moving forward, as long as interest rates remain high. Okay, so that is a huge problem because it is underreporting of interest expense. Here's what's interesting. The best year the Federal Reserve has ever had, it's made about $104 billion. That money goes directly to the Treasury. And the Treasury, the U.S. Treasury, can do whatever it wants with that money. Okay? That technically lowers the U.S. deficit. In this instance, because it is the opposite, okay, that money does not go to the Treasury, which means our deficit is not smaller, it is larger. And $104 billion is the most the Federal Reserve has ever made, so it is operating at a loss. just as large as the most it's ever made. Okay? So, couple things. We understand what's going on. We understand how we got here, which has to do with quantitative easing in 2020. And now, a few years later, we're fighting inflation. So the policies have reversed, and now we have a huge interest loss on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. So, is this fair to the American public? Is this fair to the American taxpayer? Because regardless of whether the government decides to raise taxes, okay, or borrow more money to fund the deficit and to fund interest payments, the burden falls on the American taxpayer. So when we ask this question, at first, it's probably very easy to just say, hell no, it's not fair at all. But what we have to ask is the benefit that we got from the policies that were enacted in 2020, does that benefit outweigh the problems that we're having today? And I'm not sure if I can answer that question, and I'm not sure if I want to answer that question. What I want to do is I want to kind of give you both sides of the argument and then let you decide what you feel is best. So there are a couple of arguments, okay? The first one is that the country had to be shut down, okay? Had to be shut down, and these policies were required to basically allow people to continue living, okay? And what we're experiencing now is basically collateral damage, and it's something that we have to deal with. And the American public, because they got the benefits in 2020 and 2021, those stimulus payments, those PPP, which is what was Paycheck Protection Programs, all that was, now we're experiencing collateral damage, but that was necessary. That's the first side of the argument, okay? The second side of the argument was really twofold. Either A, okay, the country had to be shut down, but we did not need to print so much money, and the government did not have to spend and borrow so much money, which has led to rampant inflation. That's one side of the other argument. The other argument is that the government did not have to shut down the country in the first place, that we overblew the problems, and that we could have avoided both. I suppose that this is more so a political question, a moral question, an ethics question, and more so where you stand on that aisle. There is no right or wrong, it's just differing opinions. The fact of the matter is we can discuss all day long what should have happened. What we can't discuss is what did happen. And what did happen is the country was shut down. A ton of stimulus was pumped into the economy. Quantitative easing and federal government borrowing. All that money has caused the problems that we are experiencing today. That is undeniable. Okay? And now, 3 years later, not only is the American public having to deal with inflation, which we are dealing with high interest rates, but on top of all that, we are dealing with a growing deficit and a growing debt crisis above $33 trillion. And this does not help. So when you look at it all together, we had policies that were required, quote unquote, by the government in 2020. Every single action has a consequence. Every single thing that we do economically has a consequence. We are experiencing the consequences from the things that we did 3 years ago. Now, for a while there, people thought that this was never going to happen. For 2 or 3 years, we had smooth sailing. It eventually caught up. Prices eventually caught up. It's a multitude of things. Quantitative easing. It's government overspending. It is supply chain issues. It's pent-up demand. Whatever you want to call it. It's corporate greed, right? Whatever you want to call it. The fact of the matter is these are the consequences from the policies of 3 years ago. And the Federal Reserve losing money is historic in nature because it is so rare. Now, removing myself from my finance background, removing myself from everything that I learned, just looking at it logically, just common sense. When an entity like the Federal Reserve, for the last 100 years plus, has made money every single year, and all of a sudden it is losing money, to you, to me, just common sense, that seems like something is not working properly. That seems like something that should be talked about more. But for some reason, it is not. This has not been a huge headline, mostly because Powell and the Federal Reserve has said this in no way, shape, or form causes any issues with their policy-making abilities. On top of that, I think there is a misconception with the American public that this entity can just print money. So why doesn't it just print money to get rid of its debt, or its interest payments? Because that exacerbates the situation, right? That increases inflation. The more we print, the more inflation will become a problem. Okay, and later on, the more the Fed will have to raise interest rates. We're stuck in this vicious cycle where the only cure seems to be raising interest rates, but that cure has its own problems, and that is causing all the national debt to be expensed at a higher interest rate. And on top of that, that is causing a huge problem for a bank that basically seems like it shouldn't lose money. So, I've given you the facts. We've talked about it. We've discussed it. Now, I guess to wrap up this video, it really just becomes a question of what you believe is right. Because the unfortunate thing is, regardless of what we believe, we're gonna front the bill. The U.S. taxpayer is gonna front the bill, like we always do. So regardless of what we believe is right or wrong, that's what's gonna happen. And until government can put us in a surplus or can at least balance the budget, we're gonna keep having these problems. Now, this is not topic for this video. It's topic for another video. But the government right now has no incentive to fix these problems, right? Because the average age of a government official in Congress or Senate or the president is much, much older than the average age of the U.S. population. So they are basically spending money now to benefit themselves and to get reelected, etc. But the people who are going to bear the burden is you and me in 10, 20, or 30 years. So that's topic for another video. I want to keep this on topic. I also don't want to get political on here. This is a finance channel. This is a personal finance channel and an economics channel. And in reality, just being brutally honest with you, I don't have a side. I don't particularly like red or blue. I don't particularly pick a side. I think there are good policies on both, and I just try to bring an economic standpoint to those policies. If I think a blue policy is good, great. If I think a red policy is good, great. But I want to just give you the facts, and I want to stay as unbiased as I possibly can. And I hope I do that. So if this video was informative, if this video spurred thought, please consider subscribing. This is a relatively new YouTube channel, and it is very difficult to stand out in a sea of clickbait. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to be clickbait. I aspire to be like the channels that are not clickbait. And I respect those channels heavily, especially those channels that have been able to push through the noise in a non-clickbait way. And that's what I want to do. So please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And if you haven't yet, please turn on the bell notification so you don't miss the next video. Usually videos are on Tuesday, but sometimes I'll do a video Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, or Saturday if something needs to be talked about like this. Other than that, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.